I'm going to rant for a moment about two sucky management styles. Maybe not the right way to put it, but bear with me. Um, these two styles are surveillance-based management and complete hands-off management. Both can suck. Both tend to be ineffective, and in general, both tend to lead to disengagement, maybe burnout, maybe frustration, and I think ultimately lower than desired outcomes and performance that you would like to get from your teams. So let me briefly explain each one. So let me tell you a quick story about surveillance-based management. So early in my career, I had this job, and basically in this job, my performance was basically completely judged on how long I sat in the office, how many calls I made, because I was doing outbound calls, how many hours a day I made those calls. And I was told exactly how to build out my call list. I was told, what exact questions I was supposed to be asking people in interviews because this was a recruiting job. How, I was told, even when I was allowed to stop work for the day. And so so we had a call quota for every day. This is how many calls you had to make. And by the way, make these calls in between the hours of 8 a.m. and noon. Like that's the time you're going to make your calls. But if we didn't hit our call quota, that meant that we would get a strike. And 3 strikes in a month meant that you'd be put on a performance improvement plan regardless of my actual results, like meaning regardless of how many people I was actually able to recruit. So here's the irony with this is that I actually learned that if I made my calls like early in the morning, like I started work early and did a couple hours of call then, and then made calls again like after work hours, I would actually be able to spend less time and still get more people recruited. Yet we had to make calls during this specific time. So the results of this was there was actually a culture of deception. People would actually start faking their calls and logging fake calls just so they could hit their rigid metrics. And there was also extremely high turnover, especially among the top performers, like especially among those who were actually getting real results, but they weren't following the described script. So this is kind of a little bit of an extreme example of that surveillance-based management style. Now, what about hands-off management style? Now, I'll be honest here, a little vulnerable here. So, a little bit later in my career, I kind of made the opposite mistake. We hired somebody that was my direct report, and basically I hired this person with the idea of, hey, just help us grow the business. Just help us grow the business. That's your job. Okay. And I kind of approached this through the lens of I just need to give this person full autonomy. And so I would tell them, hey, just get in there, do great stuff, like help us grow, right? Think like an entrepreneur. And I kind of believe that by not giving this person specific expectations, I was actually empowering them. And I thought this freedom would help kind of fuel ownership. But here's what was actually happening. They would tell me, yeah, but what do you want from me? And I kept answering with these kind of vague statements of like, hey, just be creative, right? Like, let's just grow the business. And they weren't growing the business. And I really didn't have anything to be able to kind of hold them accountable to because I never really defined what success would look like in the first place. And I started to adjust. Like I finally kind of started to get clear. I started creating clear goals, a bit more clear expectations, and kind of rightfully so, they resisted them. They kind of resisted these expectations, and they would push back. They didn't follow through, and ultimately, this job didn't work out for this person. And quite frankly, I owned that. Right? maybe they weren't the right fit. I don't know, but I also didn't set this person up for success, right? I didn't give him the structure needed to thrive in this role. So, thanks for letting me rant on those two stories. And I think these two stories represent, again, two ends of a spectrum. If we're thinking about a spectrum here, there's micromanagement on one side, which was my first story, and there's kind of blind trust on the other side. Now, both extremes tend to lead to poor results. And I want to bring Mike here into the conversation, who's been listening patiently, and I want to ask you a question.
Hi, everybody.
In terms of kind of striking the right balance on this continuum between micromanagement and blind trust, like what is the sweet spot on this continuum? Like what does that sweet spot kind of look like as far as a management style?
Wow, good question. It has a lot of moving parts, but I think I would start with it's really a mindset around managing outcomes whenever you can, as opposed to managing specific steps and behaviors. Instead of managing, your butts in your chair for 8 hours and you're doing this and this and this and this, you're managing what's the end result. And of course that is not a one size fits all. There's, depending on the context, depending on the type of job, there's different kinds of management that's required. But in
Right.
general, it's an outcome based focus, and that's kind of the overall concept that I would start with, and then there's some supporting behaviors and skills underneath that.
Yeah, I mean, so at a high level, like give me some of the characteristics of this outcome-based mindset.
Well, it would be you're going to be really clear about what great looks like. You're
Mhm.
going to define that either for the employee or better yet, with the employee collaboratively, right? Let's define what great looks like. And then you're going to, when possible, you're going to step back and let them get there the way they want to get there. Now, that doesn't preclude really positive, helpful check ins, which is not micromanagement if they're done right, right, along the way. So what does great look like? We're on the same page. We're going to have some check-ins to just assess how things are going along the way. Um, it may include being really clear about what's your, I'm talking to the employee now, right? What are the kinds of decisions that are just yours to make along the way? Which decisions are yours to make, but just let me know afterwards. Which things do I want you to come to me for first, right? It's really a lot of clarifying and getting on the same page and then letting the good stuff happen, stepping back and gifting trust, right? This trust that we at that point give the employee. And we have to be really careful with that. I've heard people say quite often, I've said it, trust is earned, right? No, trust is also gifted. And this is really one of those moments where set up the you set up the context really well, you set up the expectations, and then you gift trust. That's outcome based management.
Okay. Well, by the way, everybody, welcome to the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast. You got Ethan here, you got Mike on the other end, who already introduced himself. And for the episode today, I mean, we're going to talk a bit about, one tool, one ingredient that can help create this more outcome-based management or this kind of smart autonomy mindset. And this is about kind of working and partnering with each one of your direct reports, each one of your employees to set clear expectations and get on the same page with their job and outcomes and we do this through what we call the individual success plan or the ISP. And so the ISP is something that we encourage managers to develop with each of their employees. And we're going to walk you through kind of the six components of creating the ISP, maybe kind of six steps for creating these ISPs in a way that I think will give you your best chance at, enhancing autonomy, enhancing ownership, enhancing clarity, and creating, real accountability, kind of mutual accountability between you and your employees. So with the ISP, again, the individual success plan, think of it kind of like a GPS for your working relationship with each of your employees that answers two critical questions. Question one, for the employees is what does success look like? What is expected of me? And question number two, for us as managers, how can I best support you and help you succeed? So keep those two high level questions in mind as we're thinking about creating the ISP. You ready for this?
I am. I am. A couple caveats I'd like to throw in as we get going
Sure.
on this. You mentioned smart autonomy, and I just want to say that, this tricky balance all the time, and it's a really this is a kind of a heavy lift for managers to find the sweet spot here. Obviously, we want to give as much autonomy as is possible and safe and effective. We want to give autonomy. We can circle back to that. We also want to hold people accountable. And that's a balance that is really, really tricky. And I think that this outcome-based management is where you find that sweet spot between autonomy and accountability. So that's kind of one of the two caveats. And then the other thing I want to say, which is just to tee this up, and we can circle back to this, Ethan, is the ISP, as we talk about this, it's not always a thing. I want to be careful that we don't present this as it's this six-part thing. It is actually six building blocks that can be mixed and matched for lots of different situations. And so as we talk through these six components, just keep in mind as you're listening that there's going to be times where all six of these components are going to be in play and are going to be part of this. And there's lots of times, which we'll talk about here, where you're only going to have half of these components. But sometimes maybe only one, right? But they're all mix and match pieces depending on the way you're using it, the context you're using it. You might be using this in onboarding, which is a very different vibe and a different set of pieces than when you're using it for managing a project, for example. So, in any event, this tool it is a great tool, and it's super flexible.
hmm Okay, good, good. Thanks for those caveats. By the way, we've already mentioned this term accountability a couple times, and we're going to mention accountability throughout this episode. I just want to be clear that, in this context, when we're talking about accountability, we're not just talking about correcting, you know, behaviors that we don't want
Right.
or, giving negative feedback. I think that's where we typically go when we think about accountability. I got to hold them accountable for you know, what we're actually talking about here is kind of a broader view of accountability. And how we think about it is accountability is about taking an active role as a manager. We're taking an active role in our employees' success by collaborating with them on clear expectations and figuring out together how we as managers can best support our employees' path to success. So in a sense, accountability is flowing both ways, right? It's a two-way street. So I want to keep you to keep that in mind. Mike, would you tell us the story about the three unprofessional, uncooperative, and rude service workers?
Yeah, so these are they're three maintenance staff, three maintenance workers at a apartment complex, and they just seemed to be creating some levels of chaos. They were making repairs that weren't authorized, and sometimes they were just not making the repairs that they were supposed to be making. And there was some complaints from some of the tenants about not getting responses from them, or in one case, some very rude response. There was an actual big argument at one point between one of these guys and one of the tenants. Um, there was one time when one of them just got up and walked away when the manager was questioning them about a job that wasn't completed. And so, the manager himself, but as well as a couple other the managers they were just experiencing, these three people as uncooperative and not having good customer service skills and having attitude issues and not being professional. And, there was all this frustration with these folks, and one of them actually was being documented for discipline, and it was kind of a mess.
Hmm.
You digging in though, if you're to talk to the employees, they are experiencing some real human, legitimate, I would say logical stuff. I mean, meaning that anyone would feel what they were feeling in their situation. They were feeling confused about what they're supposed to, what their decision making authority was, like when they could make decisions and when they needed to check with somebody else. They were afraid of bringing issues to their manager because of the responses they were getting. They were feeling defensive. They didn't feel very valued. So, these weren't coincidentally, we just happened to hire three unprofessional, people with bad attitudes, right? There was something going on here in this system that was not bringing out the best in these three guys. And they were really, really frustrated.
Yeah. What a coincidence. All my employees are not being accountable. What a coincidence. All my employees happen to be rude. What's the common denominator there? It might not be you, but there could be something in the structure that's creating this.
Yeah,
And
I was talking to that CEO one time in Portland, and he said something like, 90% of our employees are negative and entitled. I don't understand it. And I just wanted to say, really, what a coincidence. You got all the negative entitled people from Portland to come work for you, right? These
yeah,
aren't, 100 negative entitled people, but there's something in the system that's bringing that out in them.
or in the water in
It could
Portland.
be that. It could, yeah, you know what?
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense now. Yes.
It's a lot of rain, it can turn us all negative. Anyways, I digress. Okay. So as you look at this case study, um, like what might need to happen to kind of help maybe resolve this situation? Like if you put on your manager hat, like what can we do here? Like what can we step back and do?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in that case, it's several moving parts, but what they all have in common is it's the communications up front that make the difference. It's the structure of how we do what we do. If these folks in an alternative universe, these three folks are hired and there's really good onboarding and there's conversations about pre-established stuff, basically, right? These are your expectations. This is what great looks like in your world here. These are the decisions that you get to make, and we want you to make them. And these other decisions, we want you to come bounce off us first, right? Here's the priorities. When you have what seems to be competing priorities, here's how we want you to stack those up and prioritize those. You know, um, Basically, it's the short version of this is the more information I have up front as an employee, the more we're on the same page, you and me, my employee and manager, about what's expected and what the outcomes are and how we're going to get there. The more we agree I'm not up front, the more we're on the same page, the more autonomy I have going forward, right? The more I get to act with confidence, and the less fires I have to put out later, right? The less trouble we're going to run into, the less problems we're going to have, which means I'm going to be a happier employee. I'm going to be more empowered. I'm going to more likely to bring a good attitude, all that stuff. So it's really about the upfront conversations.
Yeah. And I would actually bring this back to those two kind of primary questions to get answered. And if we're looking at this case study, what does success look like from me and what's expected of me as the employee? And how can I, as a manager, best support and help you succeed? So, the ISP, the individual success plan. So, there are six different areas, and these six areas are number one, connect to the purpose, which is the why. Two is about tasks, expectations, about priorities. Number three is about clarifying autonomy in their role. And number four is about defining success. Number five is creating development goals. And number six is commit to mutual support. Now, you kind of touched on this briefly earlier, but if I'm thinking about, okay, as me as a manager, should I be covering all six of these areas like each time we sit down to develop an ISP? Like, is it something I'm doing maybe quarterly with my employees each time, or is it just, once a year? I'm just curious if you could shed some more light on how this works in practice.
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I'll just say they really are component parts. When you bring somebody in to onboard, um, a more robust ISP is a good idea. So I would probably include most of the components in onboarding, although even in onboarding, the fifth one you mentioned is create development goals. That doesn't always fit there. That doesn't always fit during onboarding. That actually might come into play more likely when you're having an annual conversation or a quarterly conversation. So again, it's kind of mix and match.
Hmm.
Another example, you might be using an ISP for a time limited project. It's a really good way to use the ISP. You're going to use a lot of the same components, but you may not spend time on the first component where you're connecting their role to some greater purpose of the department. You may not do it during that piece. But you might do the second piece where you're definitely clarifying expectations and you might move into clarifying decision making autonomy. So again, it really is it's a very flexible tool that as a manager you get to use your kind of situational awareness and your wisdom to say these are the pieces that make the most sense for this situation. So you don't even actually have to always think of it as the ISP or we're developing an ISP. That's not always the context. It is a list of maybe six important conversations to have depending on the situation. So lots of flexibility here.
Gotcha. But it seems to me, at some point in time in someone's job, like having clarity around these six things, no matter where I'm at or what I'm doing, is going to be important. Like, I can't see the case where I should just be operating as an employee without an understanding of one of these six areas. Like, I
Absolutely.
understand that, like, hey, this would reset maybe for a specific project, and we might not have to connect your job to the purpose again. Like, we might
Right.
kind of understand that, or we might not have to just define like development goals
Right.
necessarily related. But
Right.
generally, like, big picture, I should understand these four or these six areas as an employee, and as a manager, I should also understand these from my employee's perspective as well. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly fair. It's very true. And keeping in mind that just a quick side note, when you first maybe have this initial conversation, when you start out with this, maybe during onboarding or at some point early on, keep in mind that how things look that day are going to probably look really different 6 months from now. And it's a good idea
Yeah,
to revisit this maybe a little bit more frequently during an employee's first year or so,
totally.
because things adjust and we don't know what we didn't know, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, having this stuff as your kind of GPS is really important.
Good. Okay. So we'll get into these six pieces here. I mean, real briefly, because I know this is an important point for you. Like, what is the general vibe? What is the general tone of these conversations? So imagine I'm sitting down as a manager with an employee, and let's just take, for the sake of this conversation, that we're gonna establish all six of these things. What's that tone? Like, what's my mindset as a manager coming into this conversation?
Basically, you should expect the employee to sit there and shut up and listen. And you
Right.
just go through these one at a time and preferably in kind of a stern, loud voice, I think is my
Mm,
preference.
well done. You should be a
Yeah,
management consultant.
you should. Yeah. Yeah. We actually talk about what you've just asked right up front before we even get into the components, because I just want people all at the very beginning to understand that this could, if we're not careful, sound kind of micromanaging and kind of top down because you're establishing all these things. So we want to balance that out, or that tendency out, by saying, no, this is absolutely a conversation. This is a collaborative, mutual. And it doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing consensus either. I want to be clear about that. The collaborative is not the same thing as saying that the employee has just as much of a vote as you do in terms of what their expectations are. Of course, you're there to set expectations, but the theme and the vibe of this conversation is relational. It's collaborative. You're listening. You're sharing, and you come away with something established that you both look at and say, yes, this is what's they're going to commit to, and you're going to commit to your part.
Good. Good. Well, let's talk about the first component here, which is connect to the purpose, which is really about the why. And so, why is this is an important step number one? And in my mind, I do kind of consider it a step number one in a sense. You might have a different view on that, but like, how would I approach this conversation with an employee? Like, what am I trying to do with the establish or connect to the purpose?
It's there's two levels here, but it's at bottom line, this is helping them understand how their role is why their role is important, so important for us as an organization or us as a department, achieving our mission, basically, right? How is what you do plug into what we do and plug into our success? So it's important for people to see that. People want to know that their work is important, that it matters, that they how they fit into the bigger picture. So that's the general idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's two levels. And they're both important. It's the organization's general mission and goal, and that is usually something an employee understands when they first come in. But this is a great chance to revisit that and help them understand how we in our department and their job plugs into that.
Right. Right. That's the key piece right there. We often understand the goals of the organization, hopefully. We don't always understand why my job is purposeful, even matters to achieve those goals.
That's exactly right. And then the second level, which is really the same thing, but it's now at a more local level, and we can miss this if we're not careful. How does your role complete the mission, fulfill the mission of this department? And that is actually a different thing. And that's really important. And I'll just really quick story about this. We at one point were asked to help coach a young man in a situation where he had been moved into an HR role in an organization that did not have an HR function. So he was actually pioneering the HR function in their organization, and he was promoted into this role. And there hadn't been a conversation about the mission of HR, and he did
Mm,
not understand it. And for the first many, many months, he believed that his role in HR was, he didn't say it this way, but this is kind of what it turned out to be. His role was to protect employees from managers. That's the way he saw HR. He thought HR was, in a sense, about making employees always happy, always giving them what they want, and
mm,
almost sort of advocating for them against the company. So that's the way he saw
mm,
HR. His understanding of the mission of HR was so off, it caused him then to misstep constantly and create all sorts of damage. And when we had this conversation, helping him understand, when the manager helped him understand what HR really is, like their HR's job is to help the organization be healthy from the top down, including, yes, individual employees, but also the organization itself has to be healthy and functional,
mm.
right? That's HR. So that was a huge adjustment for him. And that would be an example of maybe not having been clear up front about how your role fits into the mission. So it's the greater mission of the company, but there's always a sub mission, right, for the department.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, this is a key leadership skill, right? Is creating clarity, helping people understand the context in which their role is operating in,
Yep.
right? And of course, this means as we mentioned, the mission, the goals, even the values of the organization could all be part of this. But like, what's the context we're operating in? And then, of course, the other component here is purpose. Why does your specific job matter to our mission, our goals?
Mm.
By the way, purpose is one of the key drivers of motivation. They talk about this, or Daniel Pink talks about this in his book Drive as one of the core components of motivation. So this always feels like a conversation that feels can be hard for managers to have, but I wouldn't skip it. And by the way, if there is a job in an organization, presumably there's a purpose for that job that's connected to the greater mission. So really, you can get creative with this and really unpack that. So that's all about connecting to the purpose, the why. The second component here is about clarifying tasks, clarifying expectations, clarifying priorities. This is more about the what. This is kind of more of the nitty-gritties. And so how, you know, how could I approach this in a collaborative way with my employee? I mean, you alluded to this earlier. This is a collaborative conversation, yet I, as a manager, probably have my expectations and tasks I need someone to do. So, like, I don't know, could you share some best practices about approaching this conversation around tasks expectations?
Yeah, I'll probably sound a little contradictory here, Ethan, that this is probably, I might say this is the least collaborative part of the conversation, especially for a new employee. I'm not going to really ask a new employee to help define their tasks and priorities. That's what they're wanting to know from me. So there's a lot of components of the ISP that are more collaborative. Now, certainly farther into a person's tenure, there could be more collaboration on this as people might want to branch out or adjust. Absolutely more collaboration farther in, right? So let's say you're having an annual conversation, or even more importantly, or more to the point, you're talking about a project. I can see a little bit more room for collaboration on this one. But in general, employees just want to know, right?
Hmm.
Tell me what's expected of me, and help me prioritize that. And so I would generally say that, especially up front, this is the manager really providing clarity around tasks and expectations, and so importantly, priorities. And this is a piece that sometimes gets missed is, what do I do when I have X amount of things and only this much time, or when someone wants me to do this other thing, right? Help me prioritize. And then last thing I'll say on that is, this is quite often not just one conversation. This is something I want to be careful that we are clear about. This is often an ongoing conversation. This piece right here, if you're literally helping an employee define their tasks and their role, and priorities, you probably have an initial conversation to get the ball rolling and get them started, but you're probably going to want to revisit this one a few times.
Yeah. Good. I like that. And yes, the kind of nuance you're speaking to here about kind of where the employee is at in their tenure and experience in the organization makes a lot of sense. And I actually I mean, I see, I can see a lot of room for collaboration and even mostly the employee defining some of these tasks and expectations as you get further up in an organization, right? If I'm operating out on an executive level or director level, more likely, the further I move up, more likely the people below me are going to be, I'm more experts in their specific area and their specific job because I'm directing a large, area. And so this is where kind of maybe working backwards can be helpful. So we're talking about clarifying tasks, but this is where we might actually, in some cases, first clarify the outcomes, right? What outcomes are we looking for? Let's talk about that. Let's work backwards from our goals. And then as a leader, as a manager, I might say, okay, well, if these are the outcomes, in your world, like what needs to get done? Like what would be the tasks? What would be the expectations and priorities for you? Because I might like genuinely not really know because I don't see your role as much as I would as maybe a supervisor, level, if that makes sense. So
Right.
it's gonna adjust depending on the structure of your organization and kind of where you're at in that organization. So I think it can range from highly collaborative to you know, these are just kind of the tasks here in this job and in these are the expectations. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say I agree. I think like you might toggle tasks and expectations are different, and you're right. If I'm hiring someone or working with someone that's much higher in the organization, I'm going to focus more on expectations, which includes outcomes, less on tasks. And again, like you said, if it's someone who's relatively newer or on a lower level in the organization, let's be really clear about those tasks. So absolutely, this again, this is why this is such a not a one size fits all. It's a very flexible thing.
By the way, I just want to mention real quick, just some research done by Gallup, and Gallup's research, so kind of decades long study on employee engagement and just organizational performance, and the strongest indicator of high productivity, profitability, employee retention, and customer satisfaction was employees answering yes to this question. Do you know what is expected of you at work? Right? Do you know what is expected of you at work? So, if you weren't already convinced that this is important, hopefully now you are.
Yeah, and I just want to give you one kind of another byproduct of having this conversation, which we've seen. What sometimes happens in this conversation is if the manager's open and humble, they can discover in this conversation that they have provided unrealistic expectations. They haven't helped with prioritizing, they've expected too much. They've, in a sense, asking someone to not have any kind of work-life balance if they were to meet these expectations. So this is another, I would actually lean back toward what you were saying about this is another way that this part of the conversation can be somewhat collaborative is to say, let's make sure these are realistic as well. And that's why this can't just be a top-down conversation.
Yeah, yeah. I just did this a couple weeks ago with one of my employees. It was like she handles a whole lot of things. And I'm just kind of sitting down with her being like, well, let's just list all the things that like are on your plate or could be a priority. And she's listing all of these things. And I'm like, wow, I didn't even realize
Yep.
that probably should be a priority or something like that. And yeah, kind of having her identify, well, I think this is going to be important given what we're trying to do this year. And then me sounding in on that. I mean, it was very collaborative and kind of a cool conversation
Yeah.
to have that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll find that the employee has tasks that you didn't even know they had. Like,
Right.
oh, I didn't even know you were doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, the expectation that managers should know each and everything that every employee is always doing is generally in many jobs is just not going to be realistic, which is why this should be collaborative when you can make it collaborative. Yeah. Well, anything more you want to say on this one about the
Nope.
kind of clarifying tasks, expectations, and priorities?
Nope.
Uh,
It's probably the more it's probably the fuller piece of these. It's a pretty complex piece, and it deserves the time it needs.
Good. Okay. So we've covered connect to the purpose. We've covered this one of clarifying tasks and expectations and priorities. And now it is talking about autonomy and it's clarifying autonomy with your employees. And so we would discuss maybe briefly here just this idea of different levels of decision-making freedom and how it might shift over time. But I'll let you take the wheel on this one here, Mike. When we're talking about autonomy and clarifying autonomy with employees, like how are we going to approach that conversation? What are we trying to do here?
Well, I'll start by saying it's a really important conversation, and it as I dig in on this with clients, it's not happening intuitively. They're not people aren't having this conversation, and when they do have this conversation, it changes things for the better almost every time. So this is where you and your employee get on the same page in terms of what is their range of decision making freedom and get really explicit about this. And there's four categories. There's really only three, but we're going to call it four because category one is which parts of your job are yours to just do. If something comes up in this area, take care of it. If you need a decision made, decide it. If something needs to be fixed, fix it. Just do it. That's yours. You don't even need to tell me about it. That's that's just do it.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, do then tell. These are still yours, just as much as number one. But circle back and let me know. FYI me when you make one of these decisions or when this comes up and you solve it. And quick note on that, I'll just throw this at you, Ethan. Why might there be situations where I would want you to let me know when you do something in your world?
Because it might be the prompt I need to take another step or communicate something to another employee for them to do their piece.
Mhm.
Another example in my world, again with one of my with an employee is that fell into the do then tell category was post the blog post on the website and just let me know when you've done it. And the reason I wanted her to let me know when she's done it is just so I can just be a second set of eyes on, you know, small like edits or things like that. But
Hmm.
I don't need to see it in advance. It's fine if it goes up there. Just tell me. So
Yeah.
there's those things that I might want to see after the fact, prompt for the next step to kind of take place. Yeah, those are the ones that come to mind for me.
Yeah.
Another one comes to mind is just knowing when things are getting done. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, there and again, what I tell managers on this one is state the why on this one. If you can't state a why, you might be micromanaging,
yeah,
right? If I don't have a reason why I want you to come let me know, then it's just because I want to know. That's not good enough, and that's a good prompt for you to say, well, you know what? Maybe I don't need this to be a two. This can be a one. Just do it.
yeah,
Another
absolutely.
reason might be because this thing you're doing, this thing you've decided, I may hear about it some other way in a way that I'm not going to be able to support you or I'm not going to be able to be consistent with you. So that's good for you to, let me know. So yeah, so
Yeah,
that's number one is just do it. Number two is do then tell. There's parts of your job that are probably consult then do, or a better way of putting that would be consult and then maybe do, right? Let's collaborate on this one, right? You come to me first. If this comes up, or you want to do this thing, or you want to spend this kind of money, or this problem shows up, decision you want to make in these sort of categories or situations, I'd like you to come talk to me first. And I'm not taking it from you at that point necessarily, but I do want to sound in, and I have a role in that. In that case, I may want to redirect. I may just affirm what you want to do. I may say, nah, it's not going to work out. So that's my responsibility in this case to
yeah.
work with you on that. And then the fourth
Again,
category. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'll just say again, and coming back to your point of the why is important there. Why do I want to consult? Hey, look at the end of the day, the buck stops with me on this one, or this is a somewhat kind of new kind of task for you, and I just want to be able to speak into it,
Hmm.
explaining the why as opposed to just consult with me, just because.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just because I have control issues, that's why.
Yeah.
And the key for this one, which is a kind of an overall one, a concept before I say number four, is obviously we want to be looking for opportunities to move things up, or
Hmm.
I guess I should say down from a three to a two or a two to a one, right? So these things that I need you to consult with me on now, that may not look like that next year. In this particular area, you might just do it, right? And that's the goal, and that's one of the reasons we want to have these conversations is so we can move toward more autonomy.
Yeah.
The fourth category is a little tongue in cheek. Don't do this. That's not your job. That this
Right.
isn't
Just don't
yours.
do it.
Right. And this matters because, and this is, I guess, the bottom line. We, for years now, we have seen mismatch or misalignment, meaning that managers and employees do not have the same understanding of these categories within their job. They don't see it the same way. They're not on the same page because they haven't had this conversation. And the one
Mm.
case in point I've mentioned here before is when I happened to be coaching a manager and her employee separately, and the employee says to me in a couple of different ways, my manager is a micromanager and I have to come to her for everything and it drives me crazy. And talking to the manager, she says to me, this employee takes no initiative. He comes to me for everything. He doesn't do anything on his own. And they both wanted the same thing, but
Mm.
they hadn't talked about that. And so they not only had different understandings of which things fell into which category, they wanted a change in the same direction, but they hadn't even talked about it.
Mm. Yeah. Good. So the just don't do this last category. I mean, this is literally saying like this isn't part of your job. Like, don't do those things. Which obviously there's a bunch of things that are probably implied that I shouldn't do. Like, look, I'm the janitor. I probably shouldn't start, creating code, for our software. There's that stuff. So what we're talking about clarifying where there might be some confusion about things I think are my job that are not my job. Is that kind of what we're getting at?
Yeah, yeah, we're clearly not saying when you're having this conversation, list every possible thing in the world you could think of that's not their job, because that gets ridiculous, right? But you are saying where there's kind of a gray area or a close call, just to be clear about that. And this will come up more kind of after the fact, sometimes a little bit more remedial. Sometimes
Yeah.
there might be some confusion and there might be some lines being crossed. And let's just be really clear about what is and what isn't your role.
Yeah,
But
that's a really good point. The kind of the after effect, like I can think from my perspective, like I don't know what you shouldn't just do until maybe you do it, and then I'm like, oh, I don't think you should be doing that. Here's the reason why, which comes back to your point about this kind of these are flexible, right? You kind of reestablish these as you learn and as you develop with that relationship with that employee.
yeah, when we do work on this with this model, we really focus on the first three primarily. It's what's just do it, what's do and tell, and what's consult to do. That's really what you're focused on. Like you said, the four number four might come in later when there's been some miscommunication or crossing lines or whatever. But again, upfront or annually or for a project, this is another example of why this could be really helpful for a project or a time period. It's so refreshing for both the manager and the employee to just have the same understanding because now the employee can actually operate with confidence and not feel like they're going to get second guessed or do something wrong or whatever.
Yeah, good, good. I'm again, I'm learning alongside, everybody else here, and as we're walking through these four different areas of decision making freedom, I'm again thinking about, an employee, and I'm like, okay, so number one is just do. With this employee, we talked about this. It was like just do billing our clients. Just do that. I don't need any oversight over that. That's your thing. And if, you're not getting bills, you're not getting checks back from clients, that's just you to chase them down. Like that's the just do as an example. And number two is, do then tell. Again, I talked about the blog example. Just post the blog, let me know, and then I'll just take a second set of eyes on it. Number three is consult then do. This was, for example, social media posts. It's like, before you post them, create the social media posts, and then, I would like to kind of consult on them and speak into those. The reason being is because, it's kind of my responsibility to take the overall look of kind of our brand and alignment, with our language and what we're putting out there. So I kind of consider that a consult then do. And then number four is just don't do it. I actually don't have anything that comes to mind right now, but again, I'm sure as things come up, I would say, hey, actually probably don't do that thing. Maybe that's not your job. And so I'm just kind of thinking through this in real time.
No, we had an employee who here's an example for who it felt to this person like within their job was to directly call clients and do have some conversations with clients, but
Mm.
that really wasn't their role, and it actually created confusion. And but nobody had ever told her, when this sort of problem comes up for you, you really don't call clients. That's not your
Hmm.
role, right? That's a just don't do it.
So the other thing on this is that you mentioned, I think briefly mentioned just the idea that an important piece here is kind of to establish maybe a clear path towards more decision-making autonomy. So for example, if I'm a new employee, maybe a good portion of my job is at maybe the a three and a two, which is consult then do or do then tell, because I'm new here. Um, and so is the idea to say, hey, like, here's what it would look like with to move this into the category of just do. Like, I want to be able to see, successful completion of this, so many times. Like, is that the type of conversation I'm having here? Or how do you think about that?
In general, yes. In general, I really like the encouraging conversation up front of there's parts of your job, of course, that are going to move up over time. I just think that's a really good thing good conversation to have, and then remember that because of that, this portion of however you're using the ISP, this is a really flexible portion. This is the part that can change over time, and this is
Mhm.
another reason to revisit even just this conversation. This might be one part of the ISP that you come back to without all the other parts sometimes. And just revisit this and see where we want to do a little bit of shifting. That's a great conversation for a one on one.
Mhm.
I'd be careful not to make it an opportunity for micromanagement, which can be a little bit of the, okay, I want to see 17 times of this and this, before, you might
Right.
not want to get that granular. It might be more about, in general, success over time as your confidence grows. You can keep that a little bit more open ended, but
Yeah.
but that's the idea, is really giving them the hope and the experience of being able to move these up over
Yeah.
time.
Or hey, let's get through these next three projects that we have, and at the end of at the end of those three projects, let's reassess. Let's look at the how
Yes.
it went. Let's figure out where you feel like you might still need some consultation, or where you feel more confident just kind of going forward. And so there's a lot of cool ways to look at that. And would you also say that the maybe, I mean, there's always caveats, of course, but
Mm.
would you say the ultimate goal is to, over time, try to move an employee's job up to mostly number one and number two, the just do and the do and tell? Like, that's the ultimate goal that we're aiming for here.
I would have to say yes. You're right. I'm sure
You
there's
sound so
exceptions.
confident about that.
Well, yeah, because I want to be careful. But you said there's caveats, and you're right. There's definitely exceptions, because there's going to be permanent job situations where, no, I really do need to collaborate with you on this kind of thing before it
Yeah,
happens.
like we
Well,
have to have checks and
you
balances.
have
Like
to.
that's
Yeah,
just there's always two sets of eyes. Like that's internally for us. When
yeah.
we're often saying always two sets of eyes on something that's going to be outward facing.
Yeah, or you might have a decision in a bigger or not bigger. You might have a decision that has to, I mean, this has some legal ramifications whenever this comes up, and we always want to have this. Yeah, so yeah, with exceptions, I would actually concur. I would say ideally ones and twos are where you want to go. That's where you want to go. Yeah.
Yeah.
One more thing about this, Ethan, is that those four that range of decision making authority, it's a really good check for a manager to find out, are they micromanaging? And I had that experience once with a client who was told she was a micromanager by her employees, and she didn't believe it. And so I basically asked her in one of our coaching sessions to come back the next week, choose an employee and then write out their tasks, and then assign their tasks one of those levels between one, two, and three. And she came back and she literally says to me, as she walked up to me at the coffee shop, she says, "Hi, I'm whatever my name is, and I'm a micromanager." And what she had found was every single part of the employee's job was a category three.
Mm,
She had nothing, literally nothing, that she had given them autonomy over, where they didn't have to come to her and talk to her first. So it was really good, a self-awareness tool for her to realize that she needed to move some of those things up.
yeah. Very cool. I mean, the last thing I just want to say on this, and then I know we need to move on, is just that for many people out there, and I put myself in this category, that providing somebody more autonomy, like indicating that more of their job can just be like a just do or do and then tell, feels like a risk. Because I
Hmm.
feel like, hey, look, and I've really kind of feel like I've mastered this. I'm really good at it. This feels like I'm letting go of some control, right? And many people that move up in leadership and management, they got that way because they were actually pretty good at keeping things in control and controlling things at some level.
Right.
And so just recognize this can feel to you, it can feel to me like a risk. And
Hmm.
effective leadership, effective management is being willing to take some risks for the sake of allowing your employees to go through it, to even fail, and then to use that not as a opportunity for, discipline per se, but as an opportunity to learn. Like the
Yes.
best way
Yes.
you're going to learn is probably just doing it and
Yep.
then us assessing how that went and learning from that.
Yes.
So just know they can feel like a risk, but that's part of what it means to be, in management oftentimes.
Yes, and then you bounce that, and you actually said this really well up front. You do smart autonomy, right? You move toward what you just described, and you remember that it's really painful to pull back autonomy. Like, so let's measure it out. Let's measure it out, maybe slowly, maybe carefully. Let's gift some trust, but not too much trust, right? So,
Right.
man, what a tricky balance.
That's a really good point. Yeah, and it speaks back to the story I told at the beginning of the episode where the mistake I had made is just gifting all the trust up front, and then over time I had to start peeling that back, and that was just a total morale kill, and it was hard. So, yeah, lesson learned there is you're actually going to set people up for success more by starting to tactfully and slowly gift that trust as they build confidence in their role. So, okay, we've covered, so we're talking about the ISP, individual success plan. We've covered number one, connect to the purpose, which is about the why behind their job. We've covered number two, which is about clarifying tasks, expectations, and priorities, which is really about the what of their job. And then we covered clarifying autonomy related to their different ranges of kind of decision-making freedom in their job. And we're going to then cover number four here in a moment. And I just want to take a quick pause and make a quick ask of our listeners. So, hey, look it. We noticed that the majority of our active listeners, regular listeners, have not left us a review yet. And so, if you are one of those people that haven't left us a review, just I would really appreciate it if you could take the 1 minute, go into Apple Podcasts or Spotify, just leave us a quick review. Helps us grow, helps other people find this podcast, and we would very much appreciate that. So, thank you. Number four here is define success. Explore what great looks like. Now, when I think about defining success here, I'm thinking about this as okay, we're not talking about defining the expectations and tasks. We're now starting to talk about outcomes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Okay. So can you give me some examples of like defining success, like defining outcomes?
Yeah, it's we've now that we've established those first three things, including what your role is and your task and priorities and your decision making authority. Let's kind of put our heads together and talk about what does success look like in whatever this is thing we're talking about. Now, if we're talking about a project, that kind of makes sense, right? We're gonna what's the successful outcome of this project?
Hmm.
You know, we get the bid that we're trying to get, maybe, or we have customer satisfaction scores at this point, right, at this level,
Hmm.
or the rebuild is successful, and we know it is because X, Y, and Z. What does it look like if it's your job? You got to kind of take a step back, and you have to kind of look at the kind of the bigger picture now. What would it look like for you to be successful in your role as an HR manager? What would be true about the HR department? What would be true about the organization?
Yeah.
etc. We wouldn't have any lawsuits, whatever that might be. And it's okay to be aspirational here. It's okay to shoot high. But it really is kind of it's motivating. It's something
Yeah.
to shoot for and measure against going forward. Um, so yeah, I like the way you said it. This is really about outcomes, and it's a time to be even a little creative sometimes, and to maybe dream big.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really the kind of the crux of the outcome-based mindset, right? Is where we're saying, hey, look at let's define what success looks like. And yes, there are probably some specific tasks and expectations related to accomplishing this, but this is where you get to get creative and provide a lot of autonomy, right? This is where you get the opportunity to maybe,
Mhm.
if the employee is in the right place with this, to not overdefine the task and expectations to getting this outcome, but saying, you've generally done great work. Here's the goal that we're going for.
Mhm.
Yes, let's do it in alignment with our values and our commitments as a group and as a team, but get creative with this, right? And see what you can do to reach this outcome. So, yeah.
Yeah. Another direction with this, Ethan, which is interesting, is this is used for managing people that you're not maybe physically around as much, like remote employees.
Mm,
And you can get actually kind of specific. Like you could say, what great looks like for this month, right? How
yeah.
many widgets did you create? I'm just making that up, right? It
Hmm.
could be that specific. It could be, this is what what great would look like for this time period, right? This is
Yeah.
what you've accomplished, right? These are, the project got finished. That's actually an outcome right there by this date, right? So it can be very specific as well.
Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. Yeah, this is again, we just keep coming back to this point that like you got to use this flexibly. You got to take each employee and their job as an individual, right? There's no blanket approach to this.
Right.
because I come back to again one of my my stories early on that I described kind of that uh, micromanagement based environment that I was in. Right. The reality was, if we were to sit down and define what real success looked like that actually mattered to the organization, it would be, hey, what is our goal? Our goal is to recruit great candidates and then get them jobs at healthcare organizations. And so if we were to say, well, if I could find four candidates a month and place them in a job, wouldn't that be great? And wouldn't it not matter how many calls it took me to get to that? Because if that was the case, then I could get creative, which I ended up trying to get creative, which was, well, I can make calls for half the time if I do it before people start work and after they finish work when they're going to be most available. And so this is where we got to be careful of, hey, when we define those expectations, are they really in alignment with what the ultimate outcomes we're looking for here? Because I shouldn't have to set expectations that are arbitrary unless like unless I'm really having to like hold somebody's hand and just be like, all right, you know what? I think you just need to make this many calls, like, or whatever that might be, because we're not getting the outcomes we need.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, here's an example. For example, you might say for a manager, a manager, what does great look like for this year for you in your management role? Well, I might have a number of things, but I might include your employees report high morale on the
Mm,
next survey, right?
yeah.
8 or above or whatever. I mean, that would be a good example of
Yeah.
what you're describing. I'm not going to tell
Right.
you how to get there necessarily.
Right.
Now, hopefully, you're not paying your employees to choose 10 on this survey. There might be
Right.
some guidelines, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. There's this great book by Patrick Lencioni. It's called The Truth About Employee Engagement. And, he writes these kind of business fables. So it's in a cool narrative. And I love the kind of example of this in that book, which was, basically he's telling the story about this guy that was running a restaurant, and he sat down with his employee, and they were really trying to define what success looked like. And the employee was like, I don't know, I make pizzas, right? He's like, well, is it about how many pizzas you make? He's like, well, no, that's outside of my control, right? It's, we make as many as we get orders for. And so they kind of had this dialogue, this conversation, and where they landed on was, well, we really are interested in customers just being happy that come here and being
right.
pleased. And so what they landed on as far as what success looked like was count how many smiles you get throughout the day. And let's base it on how many smiles you get. And he actually tied bonuses to how many smiles, that somebody would give a customer. So this is an example of we sometimes have to get very creative once we start to define both what is in the employee's control that they can actually control and what do we really care about here in this job?
I love that. That's a great story.
Yeah.
Count smiles.
So that's all about defining success. Number five is create development goals. So this is where we're discussing kind of strengths, growth opportunities, and kind of collaborating on development goals. So yeah, I mean, what are some best practices for having this conversation with your employees?
Yeah, and obviously this is one of those moments where it's kind of obvious, that this isn't going to always be part of this conversation, right? You don't want to have this conversation too many times or too often, I mean, and you
Right.
certainly aren't going to have this conversation when you're hiring somebody. But yeah, it's an opportunity, and it can be a. We have at least two organizations right now that are having a type of conversation like this quarterly with their employees.
That's
Um,
cool.
so it's a pretty natural for this to be sort of an annual thing. But you take all that stuff we've just talked about and say, let's talk about where you're succeeding and what are you rocking in your job here? What are you
Mm.
bringing to the table that's really working? Great chance to give some recognition. Here are and let's collaborate together on what you'd like to improve. What are some things that have been roadblocks for you? What are some stuff that like places where you've been a little bit stuck? Maybe I'm going to mention something I've noticed that I'd like you to work on. This
Mm.
should not be conflated with they're in trouble or anything that has even that scent of some kind of discipline, or I've got some really hard feedback for you. That's not what this is for.
I
This
hate the scent of discipline.
Just as soon as that came out of my
Smells.
mouth, I thought that sounded really weird.
It reeks.
It does. It stinks. No, I
Yeah.
haven't.
That's
Yeah.
actually my next book. It's called The Scent of
The
Discipline.
scent of discipline.
Yes.
Your next book, as a compared to your first couple books you've
Yeah, my first.
published.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
exactly. Yeah.
Right. I would hope it's a generally an open, collaborative, positive conversation about goals for that person.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's again, it's a conversation that could be global about their performance in general, or it could be focused on this particular, maybe this project we're working on. And so
Nice.
for this work you're doing, here's some things I'd like you to, work on, and here's some things you're doing well.
Cool. Yeah. It's about learning. It's about improving. It's about even enhancing what you're already really great on,
Yep.
as you go about as you're going about, getting to the success that we've outlined, as you go
Yep.
about accomplishing your tasks. Like, hey, why don't you really focus on, again, this is collaborative, but we're really going to focus on these specific areas, of improvement, throughout the next quarter as you're working on this. So kind of keep these things front and center. I know that, and this could also, of course, I think include, learning goals, would probably fall in this category.
Hmm.
Again, coming back to the employee that I was working with on this, she kind of landed on, as far as the development goal goes, she wants to spend, which I thought was great, just take an hour a week to learn kind of a new AI tool that could help with her job. And it's like, cool, that's a great development goal.
I
If
love
you
that.
could just even have 1 hour a week, like that would get you pretty far with that. So again, something to get creative with.
I like the way I just got to pause on that. I like the way you've emphasized development goal there as opposed to like a weakness of theirs or a problem,
Right.
that's just that's kind of what we're talking about here is it's often this is just about development and
Yeah.
forward progress.
Yeah. So that's number five. That's all about creating development goals collaboratively. And now we're kind of on the final component here, which is six, which is commit to mutual support. And in my view, I mean, they're all important, but I mean, this is really kind of the crux of it. And I think it's kind of the crux of, one level of accountability. Here is where you actually get to work together to cover a few areas, which is, hey, what do they need from you as the manager to be successful here?
Mhm.
This is also where you know, ask for feedback. Like, what type of feedback should I, as a manager, be asking for here in relation to your goals?
Mhm.
And then also, what do you need from them, uh, to be successful? So it's, here's how we're going to support each other. Here's how I'm going to support you. And don't leave this piece out,
Yeah.
because this all comes together.
It's such a good chance to show humility, to remind them and yourself that that success is a mutual collaborative thing. We
Yeah.
can help each other. We can support each other. The fact that you just emphasized asking for feedback, this could be a time for you to just globally ask for feedback about what do you need from me, more of or less of, as your manager. This could be specific, for this particular project and, last year's project, what did I do that was helpful? What did I do that got in your way? This is a great chance to show that humility. And then, like you said, also to be clear, here's a couple things I need from you to really focus on for me to be successful as your manager.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said that last piece again, because this flows both way. You actually, like, this is where you're 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 communicating the message that we are, like, our success depends on each other.
Right.
I understand that partly your success depends on me as a manager, and your success or my success depends partly on you, and we're kind of intertwined in this way. And so we're asking, hey, here's actually what I need from you in order for me to be successful in my job too. And I think
Yep.
there's a level of humility with that. There's a
Yep.
level of humility with saying, like, it's not just about what you necessarily need from me because I have the power differential. It's like, yeah, this goes both ways in a sense. So yeah, it's a partnership vibe that you're kind of setting with this in a sense.
Well, and to get that, just a kind of a warning to managers and even to organizations. This kind of thing, this kind of process, this kind of tool, it can really easily lose its heart. It can really easily lose its sense of what you just said, the sense of collaboration, the sense of humility. It can lose that when organizations take it as a thing and make a form, and everyone has to fill it out, and you all have to show up at this time every year, and you all have to walk through these steps, and managers are just kind of reading it. Okay, so what do you need from me? And then they're signing it. I've just seen a lot of these processes become institutionalized, and then they become rote, and they become a box to check, and they don't feel like a relationship anymore. They don't feel like the manager is bringing this to the table because they really want both parties to be successful. And if you lose that heart of this tool, it just becomes another tool that people are frustrated with and have to fix and have to do. And so I just want to remind our managers to remember the tone, the flexibility of this, and keep it about the relationship between you and that employee, and
Yeah.
keep it about success, not about checking a box.
Right. Good. Yeah, one thing I'm hearing there is not is part of it is like not being too like rigid with this. And again, it's like a form that we're just,
Yep.
going through.
Hmm.
But in my view, that's also not to say that, hey, having some sort of form that you, or some sort of template that you use to like write down what we discussed in these conversations so we have something to kind of
Hmm.
use as
Hmm.
our compass, our GPS that we can refer
Hmm.
back to, or at the end of the quarter say, hey, let's go back and look at this. How did some of
Right.
these stuff go? Right. So we're not saying don't have a form per se. It's just don't make it a
Yeah.
box you check as a formality, and it's still a conversation.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. When I mentioned form, I didn't mean that as a standalone. Don't have a form. Yeah, clearly this being written out in most cases is a good idea, so you can come back and reference it. Absolutely. Um,
Mhm.
I think that where it becomes what I was describing is when someone up there at the top of the organization gave me this form to use, which is fine, and they haven't explained it and they haven't
Yeah.
emphasized what's the vibe that needs to be created here. And this is what
Right.
happens a lot, right? In management, in organizations, you don't train the managers as much as you just hand them a tool, right? And then it's wielded in a way that's not very healthy. So this really
Mhm.
has to be in the context of that humility, that caring for your employee, that really being committed to their success.
Yeah. Good. Love that. Maybe one question or one point I want to end with here is just the idea that, and we alluded to this earlier, but part of the reason for taking a individual success plan approach is it can actually help create more autonomy. And we have episodes on autonomy. It's obviously really important. But we've heard people before say like, like how does this ISP create more autonomy? Like it seems really micromanaging. And I think that there is just maybe a little bit of a misunderstanding of what kind of like smart autonomy looks like. But when you get that question, because I know you've gotten that question before, is like how do you explain that? How does this actually help create autonomy? And it's not just micromanaging.
Yeah, I mean it kind of relates even to the story that you told up front, that temptation for managers to say to themselves, I want to be a great manager. I want to be open. I want to give you autonomy. So we give so much openness up front, and then we end up having to pull it back. And this is the opposite of that. This is saying, no, I really want you to have autonomy. So I'm going to provide as much as I can up front. The bottom line is the more clarity that you have as an employee, the more confident you're going to feel acting independently, making decisions, doing your job with confidence. And so it is creating autonomy by sort of front loading these conversations and front loading this clarity and maybe having more conversations than you think you need to have, up front. So then you can step back and let the great stuff happen.
Yeah. I love that, right? Actually, by getting clear on expectations, roles, goals,
Mhm.
decision-making parameters can create that autonomy because you're kind of establishing these trusted boundaries that we all understand. And so the employee can actually operate with more autonomy within those boundaries you've created, which I think actually prevents the real micromanagement that can happen later that occurs when there's, you know, ambiguity kind of forces us as leaders to repeatedly intervene or,
Yes,
have a bunch of, constant check-ins or approval structures because we just weren't clear. So it
exactly right.
sounds counterintuitive, maybe to the untrained eye, but really it helps create that autonomy. And then again, this is progressive where over time people can operate even, in wider and wider boundaries in a sense.
Well, it kind of reminds me of what I think you said up front is what is accountability, right?
Mm.
It's a commitment to actively participate in an employee's success. And this is a really good example of actively participating in an employee's success.
Love it. Love it. Well, hey, let me just close with this. I would just encourage our listeners out there, like, hey, really consider trying this out. Give it a chance. I would say that if you're skeptical of this, I would, don't be afraid to kind of set it up as an experiment. Like maybe let your team know, like, hey, I want to try something new. I think it might help us kind of just be more successful, stay more aligned. I think it might help us just have more clarity as a team. But let's just try this out for a quarter. We're gonna have some one-on-ones. We're gonna have a collaborative conversation, create some individual success plans, and then, we'll reassess. Does this make sense for us? Is it working? So, be willing to try some new things, set up as an experiment, and I would also just say, if you give it a go, email us. We want to hear from you. I want to hear your thoughts on this model, any successes you've had with it, any setbacks you've had with it, questions you might have about it. So you can just send us an email at contact@nashconsulting.com and we'll get back to you. Yeah, it'd be cool to hear from you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, this has been really fun. I want to remind everybody that as they're practicing this skill using this tool, occasionally ask your employee for feedback about how this is going, how even that process is going. I think that's just a really good way to kind of double check that it's working for both parties. Shows humility, shows respect.
Very good. By the way, I know that this might be hard to kind of wrap, for everybody to wrap their head around what this looks like without a visual. So check out the show notes. We'll link a visual of this in there, and hopefully that'll help get you started and get you going. Thanks, everybody. See you next time. Hey, folks, wait. Don't go yet. Please, stay with me for 1 second here. I want to let you know about a couple cool little goodies that we have available for you. If you dig this podcast, you will probably also dig our Managing with Mind and Heart newsletter. This is a monthly newsletter where we share articles that we write about, hey, how to thrive as a manager, how to lead teams that are characterized by high morale, engagement, psychological safety, care and respect, collaboration, and high performance. You can sign up for this newsletter by texting the word leading to the number 66866. Additionally, you can go to our website and sign up for the newsletter there. Our website is www.nashconsulting.com. And of course, if you're not already aware, we have our cornerstone program for leaders and managers, and it is called Managing with Mind and Heart. Go figure. This program is something that we often bring into organizations to work with all their leaders on helping them get aligned and singing off the same sheet of music with best practice management skills and behaviors. We've brought this to hundreds of organizations at this point with really good results. And if you are not able or inclined to bring our program in-house, twice a year, in the spring and in the fall, we offer this 6-day Managing with Mind and Heart leadership development program online for anybody that would like to sign up and join us. To learn more about this online course and to register, you can go to our website. Once again, that's nashconsulting.com. Or send us an email at contact@nashconsulting.com. All right, that's all. That's it. See you later. Bye.